Kevin Leach is the main director for Sabre Training Advisory Group, a professional military training non-profit organization. Their aim is to give Ukrainian defenders the skills to come home alive. Kevin is a Canadian Armed Forces veteran with a long history of working in Ukraine and in military affairs. He served as a sergeant from 2008 to 2018, specialising in armoured reconnaissance. Some of you also may know his weekly segment on the Mriya Report called Come Home Alive, which covers key elements of training for Ukrainian army service people. And also check out the links in the description of this video to various Ukrainian charities, including Sabre Training Advisory Group. It's incredibly important for us at this time to help Ukrainians remain resilient. Kevin, welcome back.
Thank you. It's always good to be here
Before we
virtually.
dive into the huge number of topics that we want to sort of cover off or skim into, let's quickly talk about Kursk and Pokrovsk, because I've seen so many bad takes on this. So many people catastrophizing about Pokrovsk and the incremental loss of territory by Russians as if it's the end of the world, as if they're going to overrun the whole of Ukraine, and it's just such a huge kind of thing. And Kursk, meanwhile, is by many actually downplayed, although I rather suspect its psychological impact on the so-called Russian elite is much, much bigger than many experts give credit for. But I'd love to hear your take on these because you're there on the ground and obviously talking to people.
Yes, and we've had. I was just today. I was meeting up with a friend who went out to Suja and was doing a little bit of work at a stabilization point there. So about Pokrovsk, not to be catastrophic, but definitely it's something that I'm worried about. I'm less worried now that the 93rd is there. It seems like they're much they're a very large brigade and well run. So I think that they will help stabilize the situation. But it's definitely it's very nervous. The Pokrovsk. I'm sure most people who are watching this are aware, but Pokrovsk is a major logistical hub for both civilian and military traffic, and they're now less than 10 kilometers away. The Russians, I mean, so it is definitely something to worry about, but it's not a done deal. Nothing is certain. The Russians can be pushed out, especially if uh, Ukrainians have the kind of concentration of forces in there and are able to carry out the kind of planning that you saw in the Kursk operation to kind of because the Russians have put themselves now in a salient, so they have this kind of bulb that's extending into Ukrainian territory. And if the Ukrainians can press in on the sides and maybe punch in behind, then very easily that salient can turn into an encirclement, and then encircled troops are much easier to destroy. Um, so it is it's entirely possible to turn around the Pokrovsk situation. What's done a little bit better than the Russian offensive in Pokrovsk is the Ukrainian offensive into Kursk region. So I don't. My personal opinion, of course, is all my personal opinion, but I think that it's a good symbolic move. It crosses a bunch of the fictional Russian red lines and shows that they're just nonsense. It's just air that we can ignore for the most part. I don't advocate invading Moscow, but yeah, it shows that incursions onto Russian territory are not going to. It's not going to trigger World War III. Russia isn't going to declare war and hit the emergency second army button and then have 100 million soldiers appear out of nowhere. Um, and it shows that like nor are they going to meaningfully escalate as if there was anywhere for them to escalate to. So it's one of these things that shows that we can be a lot more aggressive in what we're doing, both on the Ukrainian side and then on from the NATO/allied side in supporting Ukraine. So that's what for me, that is the greatest significance of the Kursk operation, because I don't, um, they haven't taken any incredibly significant areas or sorry, settlements. Kursk is still a far way off. That nuclear power station is still a far way off. So I don't think they're going to take any kind of sort of strategic points. And I think it's just about proving to the Russians and to the world that that Ukraine has the means and the will to carry out an operation like this. Because that's the other part of it is exceptionally well planned. I was talking with a NATO officer, so just happened to be a friend of mine, and he's anyway, it doesn't matter where he's working, but he's working with NATO. And he and I had a chance to meet in person after a few years. And it's one of the things that he said to me. He said, this Kursk operation, we had no idea. And that's surprise. That was one of the things that really ruined the 2023 offensive was a lack of surprise. When you're doing bloody Hollywood style trailers for your offensive operation, you're just telling the enemy what they want to know. So this time, much better planned, at least in that. Well, I think across the board. And one of the things that it shows, and it's something that's exciting for me, because it validates that well-trained, well-trained units and well-trained and properly equipped units can carry out real maneuver warfare. And when they do, the Russians are not prepared to face it. If they don't have overwhelming superiority of artillery, the Russians can't deal with maneuver warfare, and that's a failure on their part to modernize the lion's share of their military. But it's something that we've got to sit up and pay attention to, because I remember I was sitting with a think tank guy at a dinner, and the question he kept asking, and then unfortunately not listening to me when I tried to answer, was asking, what is Ukraine's theory of victory? What is Ukraine's theory of victory? And it's like, well, to outmaneuver the Russians and destroy them using mission command and mobile, like very mobile mechanized infantry units. That's a incredibly powerful asset, especially when you consider that infantry units now in this modern age can bring their own fire support with them in the form of drones. So a bit of a digression there, but the Kursk offensive is something that is very, very exciting for me from a standpoint of advocating for training.
And the other aspect of it, which I think is really interesting, which unfortunately, when you look at certain sort of journalists and certain analysts, they talk to their area of expertise, but they don't bring it in a holistic manner. What Ukraine seems to have done really effectively here is manage disinformation and proactive propaganda around it. So without revealing secrets or expectations about the offensive, and even when it's underway, you keep a sort of blanket of silence, but you build up the kind of psychological impact of it without giving any operational details. So that seems to be very effective. But also the disinformation that preceded the operation, Russians could potentially see some of those troop buildups, but they were able to convince that it's because Ukraine thought that Russia was massing on that border. So it's almost like a sort of, inventing some disinformation to populate your disinformation. The Russians seem to have bought into this hook, line, and sinker. How difficult is it to pull something like that off?
So the military term for that is your deception plan, and it's how difficult it is. It's variable. Sometimes it's easy enough. Other times it's quite difficult. You have to really lean into the sort of play acting. And like in this case, I suspect it was more on the difficult side, because the Russians, the Ukrainians are saying we're reacting to something that we think the Russians are doing, and the Russians are saying, well, we know we're not doing that. But maybe, who knows? Who knows exactly what the Russians had planned? All we can say, or all I can say, is that it was an incredibly well conducted buildup. The deception plan was perfect. It just worked because the Russians were totally unprepared for that incursion, and that's that's what we saw when they failed to adequately respond. Certainly in the beginning, of course, movement further into Russia has slowed down, but it's not a it's I think, as I alluded to earlier, it's not just about taking territory. Honestly, the territory is worthless to us. We don't want it, but it's about sending that message. What our forces are capable of doing, what we're able to organize on a high level. So it's just a matter of, my dream is that we have Kursk-like operations going on, once a month or once every other month, and just well planned maneuver warfare going on constantly, and overwhelming the Russians with these much more mobile operations. But that's the dream.
We can't possibly comment on that. Who knows whether there's going to be more of that down the road? We know that there's been some reconnaissance going on or probing in Bryansk and Belgorod, but Russia has a lot of vulnerable border up there, especially in the intersection with Belarus. So it's probably enough speculation on that one. In terms of really capitalizing on this, again, many analysts came straight out and said, okay, this is a raid. They're going to go in, they're going to, make an impact and leave. It seemed to me almost at the start that that was nonsensical. Why would you do that? Why would you risk some of your best forces and blow through Russia's red lines if all you're going to do is, poke the bear and then leave? So it seemed likely that they were going to stay. It does seem that they're going to want to hold on to this territory through the winter. And constantly it's there, a nagging reminder of Putin's weakness. That's my take on it, at least. How important is it that Ukraine has this ability to constantly undermine the strongman image of Putin amongst his own people?
That's a good question, because I'm not certain how much of that message gets through to the average Russian person, or to be honest, I guess it doesn't matter getting through to them, but even to the Russian elite, because it may be something that they hand wave away. They go, I don't care about Kursk anyway. Um, but it is it's important psychologically for us. And there is going to be some certain percentage of, we'll say, sort of decision making capable Russians that look at this and think, okay, this is making us look bad. We're losing face. Um, you know, there's I don't know enough about Russia's, we'll say, situation with their kind of like more fragile alliances to give much of an opinion here. But I think definitely making them look like a very weak partner to have is a good thing, because it might be something that helps to shake up the um, kind of axis, if you will, that's forming against, um, I guess the allied nations, NATO plus, are aligned but non-member nations like Japan and Australia.
Well, we have to
Um,
talk about weak alliances here, because another aspect I think of this offensive is that, and a feature actually the last couple of years. Now, we could have endless debates about why Ukraine has not had the munitions in the sort of scale and quantities it needs at the right time. And it's just been this endless saga, hasn't it? And stuff eventually arrives, but it's not necessarily the best quality. It's not necessarily in the quantities required. Without getting into the politics of that too much, how important is it for the Kursk counteroffensive that allies give Ukraine what it needs to sustain that? How important is it that this thing you talked about here, which is the red lines, blowing through the red lines, showing that many of them are illusory, proving that Putin is in many respects, a bluffing. He is a hollow bully. That's not to say he doesn't have any red lines, but certainly quite a few of them have been shown to be non-existent. How important is it that allies remove the restrictions on hitting air bases and so on, with ATACMS, which has been endlessly discussed? Or is it now almost too late because this is such a well discussed thing? There's no surprise left there anymore.
It's never too late. We were always going to need the capability to put long range fires out into Russia, but the point where ATACMS could have had a strategic effect on for example Russia's long range aviation, like strike aviation, that's gone because they're our allies are telegraphing our actions for us by uh, making us publicly ask, could we pretty please have permission to conduct the war the way we need to? Um, it's that these restrictions have to go. They're completely insane. I what have I can't say what I've learned, but what I've heard, what I've been told. This is by the sort of think tank people, and this is what I also picked up when I was in Washington D.C. Earlier this summer. Is that there of course there are always factions in ruling parties, but it seems like the current, I don't know, dominant faction in the American administration does not want Ukraine to win. And it's not any, I don't know if it's any animus against Ukraine, but it seems to be at the very least that there's kind of imperial dynastic thinking, like it's like the 18th century or whatever, the balance of power. We have to maintain the balance of power. And or I guess it was 19th century, but whatever the reason for these restrictions, they are stupid and they gotta go. Um, it it's just nuts that we people have been characterizing it that NATO is doing more to protect Russia than Ukraine. Um, Maybe that's a little bit hyperbolic, but they certainly are doing a lot to protect Russia.
Well, there's a meme, isn't there? There's a Ukrainian meme going around, which is, Biden Sullivan, you closed the wrong sky.
Yes, yeah, it's that's a perfect way to put it. Even hell, and it's not without that point is not without merit because let's look at this. The Romanian Air Force admitted that there was a Russian drone. I suppose it was a Shahed. Um, but anyway, some kind of Russian drone or munition flying through their airspace, and they sent an F-16. They scrambled an F-16 to escort it, so it could re-enter Ukrainian airspace and end up somewhere in Odessa. That to me is like, okay, so you have closed the skies over NATO are closed to Ukrainian missile interceptors and certainly Ukrainian planes, but they are not close to Russian munitions, and you will in fact make sure that the Russian munitions gets safely to its target. Like
That's a
I
level
know,
of
I know.
insanity, isn't it? I mean, that is insanity. There's no military reason to do that.
I'm not being fair in the way that I characterize it, but that's how it looks. What is your excuse otherwise? Why not just shoot it down? Turkey shot an entire Russian fighter plane down for violating their airspace, and it didn't cost anything. So shoot the drone down. It's very very simple. But
It cost nothing, but it proved a very important lesson because Putin didn't try it on with Turkey again. So actually, it
exactly,
wasn't, yeah.
but it was only a costly signal for Russia because they were out a plane and a pilot. But no, the timidity with which Western or sort of allied, if you want to call it that, governments and bureaucracies face Russia it's completely astounding because if uh, I don't know, take the U.S. off the table. Obviously, the U.S. could annihilate Russia in a week, um, nukes notwithstanding. But put Poland into this theater, the Polish army into Ukraine. The war's over in probably a few months. The the superiority of mission command and maneuver warfare over Russia's kind of like Soviet style detailed command and sorry, for those people that don't know, mission command is where you have decision making at each appropriate level. So a sergeant will be empowered to make a lot of decisions at the, say, squad level. The captain or lieutenant that's in charge of his platoon will be making some higher level, more strategic decisions, and it goes up from there. But everywhere along the line, they are trusted to make those decisions within flexible parameters set by their mission. Whereas detailed command is you will go here at exactly this time, you will do exactly this, you will move along exactly this this route, and detailed command was abandoned by all of the major Western forces back in the First World War. And it's outrageously superior. And we see that when our maneuver forces go in and melt through Russian forces almost as if they weren't there. That can be achieved any number of times. You just need to have the right place and time and have a deception plan and logistics and training to actually support it. But it's all a long way to say that the timidity is not justified. The way that Western governments seem to be shaking in their boots dealing with Russia is again, it's completely insane because it doesn't match reality. And I don't know what their fears are. I haven't spoken to anyone that represents that kind of say faction within the U.S. administration. I doubt anyone like that would be interested in talking to me anyway. But I struggle to understand it because it has an enormous toll on us here. It's as you said, we're fighting. I think you just said it. Anyway, we're fighting with our one hand tied behind our back, and for no good reason.
And I've talked to people who talk to the people that you mentioned there, and three reasons. I'm not saying this is fact or this is absolutely true, but this is a working hypothesis. And the three reasons that I've heard, at least, that come most prominently, most frequently, are: one is the nuclear threat, so it's Russia's nuclear saber rattling, but also nuclear is this idea that Russia is just going to collapse into a bunch of warlord states, and they're all going to be nuclear armed warlords roaming around, selling to everybody. That, I think, is genuinely believed or feared as a likely scenario. I don't buy into that at all. And in fact, when Russian propagandists themselves propagate those narratives, you think, oh, hang on a second, that's a form of coercive control, and they themselves, they probably fear certain things, but they don't fear that, and they're just using it to manipulate us. And then there's the great power hypothesis, which unfortunately comes through extremely clearly. When Karamurza and these other so-called oppositionists were released, and I'm not going to completely slate them because some of the stuff they say is interesting. Some of the stuff I vehemently disagree with. But it was interesting observing Jake Sullivan and others who were involved in that and the way they greeted them. They were in some kind of cosplay version of the Soviet Union collapsing. It's some 20th century foreign policy kind of Cold War wet dream. And it was really bizarre looking at it. It's like you can find 1,000, 10,000 people in Ukraine who are more coherent and doing more for the civil society and politics of their own country than these guys. But no, you're living in some kind of great power fantasy. Anyway, that's my rant out of the way there. Kevin, another area we're talking about before we hit record was the inability, it seems, of Western democracies to also defend their information space. And we've had some extraordinary news kind of breaking over the last couple of days about Tenet Media. This seems to be the tip of the iceberg. The DOJ has hinted at or named 800 significant influencers. Now, it hasn't given their actual names. It's just said there are 800 that are being investigated. They're tracking 1,300 Russian influence networks worldwide, but 800 are based in the US. So this confirms one thing, which I think we've known about for a while, which is the majority of investment in assets and use of lids and so on is focused on the US. That is Russia's number one target. Everything else is fairly, secondary to that. But also the idea that Tenet Media and the 5 podcasters, that's a tiny, tiny fraction of supposedly this list of 800. So do you think, well, we'll get into the details there, but do you think we've been very poor at protecting our information space from essentially paid networks and agents of Russia?
I'm gonna say something that's yes. So short answer, yes. But I'm going to say something that's probably going to piss off a lot of people. Hopefully, it gets them thinking.
That's why I have you
I
on,
think,
Kevin.
yeah,
It's to wind people up the wrong way.
I'm good at it. I'm good at it my whole life. But no, so yes, we have uh, we've allowed penetration of agents like this. So we've talked about um, people that are or are not assets. So Lauren Chen and I forget her husband's name, Liam something or other. They were the owners of Tenet Media. They knew where the money was coming from. $10 million given to them, and then the other sort of people that are I don't know how they were named. I forget if it was in the DOJ release, but the big influencers. So there was Tim Pool, Lauren Southern, Benny Johnson, uh, some others doesn't matter. But the big one that I like for me that I was familiar with was Tim Pool. And what was interesting to me was that there was that little degree of separation. So Tenet Media knew where the money was coming from. The influencers themselves didn't necessarily know. In the DOJ release, one of them asked, "Where is this money coming from?" And Chen and her husband made up some name, uh, some vaguely Slavic sounding name, and said, "Oh yes, it's this rich guy that just who knows." It didn't go into detail of what story they told about why this rich guy wanted to give him $10 million. By the way, if any rich people are watching and they want to give us $10 million, we will, believe me, we will put it to very good work. But anyhow, they there's this is a case where Chen and her husband are assets. They are assets working for the Russian government. They're taking money directly from RT employees, okay, and they know it. The others, I really do, regardless of the political positions they take, I do believe that they were duped. I actually used to watch, my goodness, what's his name, Tim Pool, and it was one time, he said he hated being lied to, and kind of seeing his reaction, like he seems to be genuinely angry about the situation. And so here comes the part that I'm going to say that's quite controversial, probably. And I think that one of the biggest things that we've done to make ourselves more vulnerable in our information space is by crying wolf way, way, way too many times. Being a Canadian, I hear about, for example, our trucker convoy, about how it was Russian this and that, and Russian funded and Russian disinformation. So I'm not going to say who exactly I know, but I know people that work in security on at a high level on Parliament Hill in Canada, and one in particular walked through the protest every single day and stopped and talked to people. I know others that were involved, and like it's you can disagree with them, but there are people that have say countering views, uh, maybe against the majority, countering political views, and they like it or not in a democracy have a right to express that. But when we sit there and go, oh yeah, well this is all Russian disinformation, um, and then maybe something turns out to be true. There's another one, Joe Lindsley talks about this, but um, the president's son's laptop, okay, Russian disinformation. Whoopsie daisy, a little while later comes out in court that it was actually a real thing. This laptop existed. It had certain information and stuff on it. Like we not we. people within our societies cried wolf too many times, and then they created a kind of suspicion and a kind of fatigue around, yeah, this is Russian propaganda, that's Russian propaganda, I'm Russian propaganda, and you're Russian, we're all Russian propaganda. And so when the real Russian propaganda came along, it was like a reverse vaccine. It gave this perfect window into our information space, and so I do feel that we've done a poor job of policing our information space, but maybe not for the reasons that many people will think.
Yeah, people get fixated on that, and then it becomes a political football. So people will focus on the right wing networks that have money injected into them. They won't necessarily focus on the left wing ones, or at least then it becomes a football. You're a Russian asset, you're a Russian asset. No, the fact is,
Yes.
Russian is going to pollute anything it can find. It's going to weaponize anything it can find, whether it's extreme left, extreme right. And that also includes the cultural sphere, the highbrow, those who will invoke their privileges, intellectuals and academics, people who consume culture. Well, we have a right to expression. You know where I'm going with this. You'll
Yes,
have
I
a
do.
pure Russian shit sandwich propaganda movie, part funded by the Canadian government and given a platform at the Venice Biennale. I mean, this is probably more damaging than many of the podcasters in some ways.
And the Toronto fucking International Film Festival, if you don't mind me saying it. I added an extra F in there for people that don't know. That was brutal, brutal, and to see TD Ontario, our provincial broadcaster, running cover for them, and it's like, well, it's a nuanced view of what this woman is an RT employee, and they played it. I love how they're like, oh, it was an unauthorized documentary. Yes, because Russia is so well known for uh, the safety of unauthorized journalism. Who was the lady that was shot in her elevator for talking about Putin's corruption?
It's
Oh, I
Anna
don't remember.
Politkovskaya who was criticizing
Yes.
Chechnya. Yeah, well, that's what happens
That
if
was
you're
it.
a real oppositionist. Yeah.
Exactly. When you're a real unauthorized journalist in Russia, you are murdered. This one was allowed into the combat area, talking to the troops. Unauthorized, my ass. I hope I'm not being too vulgar or crass, but my I'm not. I refuse to be that credulous. Like it's nuts, and it's again, it's shameful. It's shameful that Canadian taxpayer money found its way onto this project, and it wasn't as if they it wasn't as if they gave the grant for it, uh, you know, 3 or 4 years ago before this kicked off. This is it's nuts, and this is, yes, it's that high culture, high brow. I'm part of the metro, the cosmopolitan global elite, and oh yeah, so I was down in Cannes. Okay. Oh, pardon me. I said it. See, it shows how provincial I am. I said Cannes instead of Con, but you get my point, right? Which is it seeps in everywhere. The one of the original uh, sort of RT shills in America is a communist named Max Blumenthal, and the guy is an egregious. I won't be any more crass than I already was. Awful, awful human being. And but he's a communist. He's not one of these sort of a lot of the other people they targeted through Tenet are kind of like on the libertarian-ish side. They want small government. They don't want to be entangled in foreign wars. Whereas the internationalist communist is like, there's never been an expansionist dictator he didn't like, as long as they have enough red on their flag. Um, it's nuts. This stuff gets everywhere, but this is. I tweeted about this using the only Twitter account I have, which is a Sabre one. But I mentioned how Adam Curtis goes into amazing detail in is it hypernormalization? Yeah, hypernormalization, about how Russian disinformation, real Russian disinformation projects work, and they go by supporting every single possible side in a society, and it creates not a like you're not trying to at this point you're not really actually trying to convince people of anything. You're trying to convince people that it's impossible to really know the truth in any direction. And this is we can see this. We can it's it's out there relatively like that's the other thing too, which we need more information from the FBI, from the DOJ, who's being paid. And what must not happen is it must not become a partisan thing where the DOJ releases information on people that support X party and retain information on people that support Y party. It needs to be shown that it is a what's that word they love, bipartisan problem, because we need bipartisan solutions. Some point that I want to get onto in this, and it's just because it's something that's very close to me, is like on for us, for those of us that are supporting Ukraine, we also need to start thinking about how we address the information space. And something that I saw, people are going to think I'm angling to get on his podcast, but something that I saw is the way people were talking to Tim to and about Tim Pool on Twitter, saying really awful stuff. And really, it's not like strangely enough, none of them are going after Lauren Shen and her husband and or even like the tenant media account. A lot of them, I saw the vitriol being pointed at Tim at Pool, and it's like, how does that help? Yeah, it might be really emotionally satisfying to call him a bunch of names on Twitter and tell him he's this, that, and the other thing. But why don't you try it this way and say, hey, Tim, you hate being lied to. You were lied to. Would you like to know what else you were lied to about? Like probably, I think if there was enough that it would seem lucrative for him to do, people could convince him to come out here and say like, hey, like actually go on the ground in Ukraine and tell us, is it, are there Jewish Nazi Ukrainian death squads running around grabbing brand new male babies out of the maternity ward to be thrown in? I'm exaggerating now, but like are there little vans going around snatching people off the street? Is everyone living in fear? Is there, does anyone even care about, oh no, Zelensky canceled the elections, and hey, why was that? Oh, because the Ukrainian constitution says that in an emergency situation, you can't have elections. Like it's all, I believe that it's better for us to try and reach across to people that we don't see eye to eye with in every way and say, come, let me help you understand why I see the situation in Ukraine this way, rather than say, hey man, you're an f this f. I'm trying to swear less now, but
Yes. We
damages
don't we
that
don't
I
want to
get.
get the video taken down.
Oh, not the first
No,
30 seconds I heard.
that's all right. No, we're okay. We got away with it, but
But yeah, no, it's like we what I saw when I went into Washington, and the more I kind of get involved on the political side, um, advocating for training in Ukraine, is that we've got to build coalitions because you can get a lot done that way. There are, to come back to the American example, um, there are tons and tons and tons of Democrats that are very strong supporters for Ukraine, and believe it or not, the majority of Republicans also support Ukraine. The Republican voters will say. I think probably even the majority of representatives do, elected representatives. And so, like, that's what we've got to build a coalition. We have to get bipartisan solutions because the it's an election year. It's an election. We can hope and we can make predictions, but we won't know until November which way it's going to go. And for those of us that are out here advocating for and especially the ones who are fighting for Ukraine, we don't have the option of saying, well, the wrong president, it's the wrong president, so now we give up. We're going to have to, this is what the defense attaché that I met in Washington said. and this is what Zelensky said recently as well, is like we will work with whoever is in whichever administration comes to power in the United States, because that what else are we going to do? They are democratically elected, and it's another country, and they are an ally, and it's their internal politics, and that's, I think that those of us who are on the Ukrainian side, even if we are very partisan, even if we are working from inside of those countries, we need to step back, breathe, and try to find that coalition, try and find the way to go forward, even if the election goes the way that we don't want it to. And that's, I don't say that to expose any particular opinion on my end. I'm a Canadian. I, I don't have so much of a dog in that race, but it's it's just better than doing the, you know, aggressive, like maximalist aggression, you know, hyper partisanship, because it doesn't get you anywhere. You don't build anything constructively by constantly trying to tear down the other guy.
And we're
And so,
all, yeah, absolutely. And we talked about this quite a bit and exchanged messages about this. Um, we're all telling stories at the end of the day. You know, whether we choose to try to look or try to at least be objective, or if we try to go to primary sources, we're all telling stories. The question is, are you telling stories to enhance your own position? Are you telling stories to enhance your own party, your own tribe, your sort of partisan view of the world? Are you open to sort of first party input or not? I think these are the crucial questions to ask some of those podcasters. Are you prepared to listen to stories other than the ones you've heard second and third hand? And if you are, then we should have those dialogue with anybody who's willing to listen. We're also telling stories. And I think we've come to the conclusion that rather than endlessly slinging mud at each other, which actually is what Russian propaganda wants us to do. That's the whole point
yes,
of the funding you mentioned there, of funding all sides. It's to stoke division and disharmony and prevent people from forming a plan and you know coming together to take action. We need to tell other stories, positive stories that encourage people to engage with reality, engage with their community, and engage with solutions rather than, as you say, tearing each other down. Do you think Ukraine, in the sort of existential struggle it has for survival, has found some tools that are quite helpful in that? Tools in cutting across partisan boundaries and in utilizing civic society as well as their strong identity and culture. Are there things we need to be learning from Ukraine in our increasingly dysfunctional information spaces?
I think so. That, to be honest, that question alone is worth its own conversation, because it's so different. Things are done so differently here. The attitude of people is so different. The relationship of people to political parties is so different. And I think that there's a lot that we could, those of us, well, from, in my case and in the West, in other cases, can definitely benefit from some of the attitude, and like some of the attitudes that are present here in Ukraine. But to come back on the to telling stories. So it's funny. One of the old friends that I have in the army worked in psychological operations, and he was very heavily involved in psychological operations against ISIS in Iraq. And he told me one of the stories. It's not for here, but it was very, very cool. But what he said is he said that they found is that you don't really get very far by telling people, like trying to take apart the other guy's lies, trying to like go with like hard logic and truth. Those are important, but those aren't very persuasive. He said that where you really make your gains is by telling better stories. And we have the best stories here in Ukraine. We have the heights of human decency and the absolute lows of human cruelty that have happened here in Ukraine. Things that resonate throughout history. And we've just, that's what we can do, is we can tell these stories. And there's got to be a way to put it, to make it interesting. Like it's a weak literary reference, but it's one I've got. But George R. R. Martin, basically took the War of the Roses out of your guys' history and and kind of jazzed it up with some stuff, sexed it up, I'm sure a lot, and then fired that out as a very compelling narrative. So let's find a way to do something like that. Obviously, not in a fantasy format, but you know, tell these stories because they're amazing, and they're going to help us fight that information more. So yeah, tell better stories. Reach out to people. I guess try and find peaceful ways, like within our disagreements in our societies, find peaceful solutions. Save the violence for our actual enemies. I think that's the best way that I can put it.
And that's, of course, what we're trying to do in the channel. That's what you're trying to do in your media presence on the Mriya Report. You're teaching defenders how to defend, but you're also trying to propagate these values of constructive disagreement between
Yeah.
allies. Because if we don't master that, then Russia wins, essentially. It's always a pleasure having you on here, Kevin. And we had a great signal. I know you're sitting in the car, but we had a great signal today, which I'm grateful for too. Very much look forward to our next conversation, and I strongly encourage people to check out your appearances on Mriya Report. We'll pop a link in the description of this video.
And thank you for having me on. It's every conversation is great. I can't wait till you get out here and we can talk in person because if we have a good 2, 3 hours, I think it'll have be a lot of fun.